Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Schaefer Distinguished Scholar Lecture. I'd like to give all of you a warm welcome all across the Gallaudet community and the interpreters and everyone who are here with us today. Before the lecture, we have a couple of comments by people who have come to welcome us. The Graduate School and Professional Programs has sponsored this lecture. Dr. Erding is here, so I'd like to thank her for her support and her department's support. I'd like to welcome Dr. Hurwitz, who's here to make a couple of opening remarks. Hello and good afternoon. I'm delighted to be here to introduce a very distinguished person from Australia. And I understand you were born in London and then eventually moved to Australia. This is a very exciting program that focuses on translation, interpretation research. And that's always been one of my passions for many years. As I was telling Dr. Napier a bit earlier, I did my dissertation on interpretation. And back then it was called reversed interpretation. And that was 30 years ago. And I'm a bit afraid to look at my dissertation now to see how it looks like in light of current realities. But this is a great opportunity to have a sharing of ideas, to share research and find new ways to improve the field of interpretation and sign language studies and interpreting studies. And we have a distinguished visitor in the field who is a practitioner, a practicing interpreter, a certified interpreter in BSL, if I've gotten that right. So her certification is as a BSL interpreter. And she's devoted a great deal of time to research in the field and training future interpreters. And that's a wonderful match for our vision here at Gallaudet of training interpreters for the future. Gallaudet is uniquely situated because it's a comprehensive program that offers a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD in interpreting. And there's no other place that is able to do that. And so I look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you, President Hurwitz, and I'd like to now invite Provost Weiner to the stage for a few comments. The President said it very well. Interpretation is about 40 years old, not really since the founding of our ID, but rather interpreting has been going on since the founding of civilization. Wherever communication was happening and people who were using two different languages were engaged with one another, interpretations were happening. Now, our research and scholarly work in this area is in its infancy in these last 40 years. But Dr. Napier is certainly paving the way and has done some seminal work in publicizing the science and art of interpretation so that we can move the field forward into larger endeavors in the future. And welcome and thank you.
Thank you, Provost Weiner. I'd like to elaborate a little bit on Dr. Napier's accomplishments. She's recently become an associate professor at Macquarie University, which is in Sydney, Australia. In Australia, they have a different system of faculty ranks. They start with associate lecturer, senior lecturer, associate professor, and then full professor. And so the associate professor is virtually equivalent to our full professors. She's the chair of the graduate program in transliteration and interpretation. And in that program, they include 6 different languages and Auslan. She's the author of international research work. So she's not only a practitioner, but she's also a top researcher in the field of interpretation. She's written books and book chapters and articles in several volumes. She's also co-authoring a book with Dr. Cynthia Roy. She's also written a textbook titled A Sign Language Interpreter. And many interpreting training programs all across the world use that textbook, including our program. And so we're thrilled to have her here with us today. Gallaudet University would like to give you a warm welcome. Dr. Napier.
Thank you very much. Thank you once again. I certainly appreciate all the different welcomes that I've received this morning. I came into the auditorium and I was feeling just pretty much elated, and I have to say I have to calm down just a bit. But I'd like to show you this picture I'd like you to take note of here on the slide, which was very important to me and I thought fit well for my trip here to Washington, D.C. and Gallaudet. If you look at the hands indicated in this picture, of course, indicates the use of sign language, and also is attached to an airplane, which I was on for 21 hours to get here to speak to all of you. So I thought this encapsulated my visit here with you very well. I'd like to thank President Hurwitz for introduction and looking back at his own research from 30 years ago, where he was one of the people on the forefront of initiating research into interpretation those years ago, especially sign language interpretation. So my comments today are going to be looking at research from that time as well as the whole corpus of research that exists today. So our work and your work and the work of many of the scholars and practitioners in our field, hopefully we'll look at in some here today. I'll be talking about some researchers by name, what type of work they've done, and things like that. I'm not going to focus on solely sign language research, but rather spoken language interpretation research as well as signed language research. So we can both benefit in both fields from the work in each of our disciplines. Now, the big but. You know, the work of an interpreter can generate some complaints. Perhaps the interpreter feels that the hearing speaker is speaking very fast, or perhaps the interpreter is thinking the deaf person is signing very fast, and it causes a lot of issue with the interpreter. So I think that it depends on who you're interpreting for, and I know that any interpreters who have interpreted for me into a sign language have always said, please, please slow down, because they've called me a very fast speaker. Today, I'm going to be using American Sign Language, which means is my pace is going to be hopefully a bit slower than my spoken language pace. I was born to deaf parents in England, and I was bilingual in English, spoken English, as well as British Sign Language. During my childhood and my grade school years, I started to learn French, spoken French, and I studied that for about 6 years. I'm not very fluent at all in it now, but I was back then. I also learned a bit of spoken Spanish for 2 years, but that has pretty much gone down to nothing in my vernacular. And then 12 years ago, I moved and began to live in Australia, at which time I began to learn Australian Sign Language, Auslan, signed like this. And also, I worked in New Zealand as well. And their sign is called this, New Zealand Sign Language. There are some similarities in the two signed languages, as well as British Sign Language. All have familiar linguistic parts to them. And so it's easy to go back and forth from those three languages one to another when you are just speaking in Auslan or New Zealand Sign Language, etc., as well as BSL. So my languages, as I mentioned, are BSL, English spoken, and also French, Auslan Sign Language, and New Zealand. So then in my travels to America, I was able to learn ASL. So I'm now presenting to you in my sixth language, which is why the pace will be somewhat relaxed and not at the pace that my brain is actually going in, but rather I'm going to be contemplating how to sign things in a certain way. But I did decide to present in ASL. I figured it would be important for me to do that and communicate with this community directly, and also with full respect to the working interpreters here. But here at Gallaudet, I felt that it was very important to communicate directly, so I'm hoping that you can bear with me a bit in some of my miscues or other misfirings of my language. I will probably have some influences of BSL and other languages that I'm using. So if you don't understand, please bear with me. I think that we'll be all right. So research is ... You see the picture here of the boy with the magnifying glass looking at all kinds of things. I'd kind of like you to have that vision set in your mind when you think about research, and then we can kind of break it down a bit more from there in looking specifically at the research around interpretation. So in the course of research, we do have kind of our magnifying glasses out, and we come up with a finding. And we see a question that comes into our minds, and we want to further our knowledge in those particular areas. When we look at research in a larger framework or in a systematic framework, we realize that we can't just look at things willy-nilly, but rather we must have more of a focused, systematic way of going about this research in a very planned, analytical fashion. So when we look at the body of research, why is it even necessary? Maybe we realize that research that had been done in the past, we want to check on that and see if, given current realities, that research is still holds or still stands. Or perhaps it can be furthered in some direction. So when we look at research done in one area and then research done in another area, perhaps we see ways that those two can come together to create new knowledge. Or perhaps a problem has come to light that we realize needs attention, and we want to focus our energies in that respect, doing research to have a better understanding of this issue or problem that has been posed to us. Maybe we need to have both those practitioners as well as the researchers working together to advance the knowledge in our fields. There is so much work that has been done and has been done well that we want to focus on that. So of course we realize the importance of research in the world at large, enhancing our understanding of these areas that we're looking at. That this world of work that we are facing is something that we can look at very carefully and in a focused, systematic way. we have this body of research. And this research is at somewhat of a general level. So then when we look at research in the field of interpretation, especially interpreting research that I have done, particularly in British interpreting, British Sign Language interpreting, I would like to talk about the difference in translation and interpreting research in general over languages, spoken language, and then also focus on sign language research and how there might be correlations between these two bodies of work. So there are a list of leading researchers in our field that are very much people that we aspire to and have made publications of their work. And I personally felt that I wanted to be one of those researchers. There are a few names of folks that I could list out for you. Daniel Gilles. A few of you may have attended the CIT conference very recently, and he gave a presentation there. He's been in the field of translation and interpretation for many years. Another female researcher, Miriam Schlesinger, who is another renowned researcher, very prolific researcher. She has also been an excellent researcher mentor to up-and-coming researchers, giving them the kind of support they need to go on and publish their research findings. She has been a role model personally for me. Another gentleman named Franz Hochscher, who is from Austria. He was actually one of the first spoken language researchers who also looked at the field of sign language interpretation and saw the similarities between the two groups of interpreters. He was one of the first researchers to look at those similarities. When we look historically over the last 50 years at research and publications in our field of translation and interpretation, we see more and more of them as the years go on. Looking back at the early publications, a person might take some note of their experiences and their observations as a practitioner, and they basically see them as their own personal theories, not necessarily looking at it as a research opportunity. So research in the past was more anecdotal in nature. When we look to the years in the 1970s, more and more research started to happen then, and there was more in-depth research into the art of interpretation. And that was looking more at conference interpretation or simultaneous interpretation at that point in time. The focus of those years of research were focusing particularly on what was happening in the interpreter's brain and how that processing of the two languages was taking place in their brains. More of the cognitive issues related to interpreting. So the psychological and cognitive areas were heavily focused on in that time frame. So again, much of the research that existed in this time frame was more anecdotal in nature, where individual practitioners would relate experiences that they had in the act of interpreting and would contemplate those with their research element in mind. When we look at the decade of the 1980s, Dr. Gilles indicated there was a need for more research in the fields, more scientific, empirical research. He acknowledged the anecdotal research that had been out there and acknowledged the value of it, but realized that much more in-depth empirical research needed to happen, that there was an insufficient corpus of research at that time. He also indicated that there needed to be more collaboration with other disciplines of research. That interpreters, of course, wanted to do research and needed to, in fact, collaborate with researchers in these other disciplines. So his call for continued research really ignited the flame of various practitioners to take on the effort of doing further research. Felt that it was very important to have kind of more of an academic-based focus for the research in the field. We started to look at 3 fields in particular where the research we felt could be combined with interpretation research. We saw researchers collaborating in these other fields that you see here on the slide. So as time went on, more and more scientific research was happening in spoken language areas of interpretation. And again, there were many fields where this work could become collaborative. There was research into the pragmatic issues related to interpretation. There were qualitative studies taken on where there were interviews with interpreters and interviews with conference attendees who were making use of the interpretation services, asking their opinions about the quality of the interpretations that they were hearing. Also in the field of psycholinguistics, taking a look at the cognitive aspect of interpretation, really figuring out what is happening in an interpreter's brain as they're processing the 2 languages. Also looking at the field of linguistics and sociolinguistic research in all the subdisciplines of linguistics. The bulk of the research was focused on conference-level interpreting and simultaneous interpreting at that time. And again, mostly in the psycholinguistic realm. There was that was really prolific at that time, where the research was happening then, influenced the models of interpretation that were developed after that. There was a lot of research around the role of an interpreter. So up until that time, they had done so much work on the cognitive aspect of interpreting that there wasn't much research on the interpersonal relationships that interpreters had with their clients, those who were benefiting from their interpretations. In the case of spoken language interpreters, these interpreters were seated high up in a booth, far from the audience that was making use of their interpretations. They were up in a booth with a headphone on, and they had the source language streamed into their headphones. So they were very out of touch with the clients of their interpretation services. So it was not really a two-way type of communication. So the field of spoken language interpretation realized that there was a disconnect there between what happened between conference interpreters versus community interpreters. Community interpreters were more dialogic. They were functioning more in a liaison role. When there's a person sitting directly in front of an interpreter, be that the deaf or the hearing person or the French speaker and the German speaker, two people that speak different languages making use of an interpreter in those kinds of triads. So also wanting to discuss, thank you, the sign for legal interpretation. These triads could be happening in the legal setting or the medical setting. It could happen as a result of a person traveling to a foreign country and not speaking the language there, not understanding the culture of the country that they're in or the systems that were in place there. So oftentimes it meant that there was a power imbalance between the speaker who used a different language than the country that they were visiting. So that's where the community interpreter role became very important. So spoken language interpreters realized that there was a difference in the way they interpreted when it was a dialogic or community type of interpreting rather than when they were in a conference level type of situation. So there was more consecutive interpreting happening in the triad situations, whereas it was simultaneous in the conference level interpreting. And they started to realize the differences in these two types of interpreting, and more research began to happen around those areas. And they realized too that psycholinguistic research was not sufficient in looking at these types of community-based interpreting scenarios. So that's where research went in a bit of a different direction. So we see that more interpretation has happened, more research has happened around this type of interpretation. So when we look at conference interpreting research, which was still ongoing, and then the beginning of the corpus of community level interpreting, both of these researchers were collaborating with other researchers in these related fields. So they were able to collaborate on interpreting issues specifically. And I would say that the three most prominent fields that were collaborating together is the fields of psychology, the fields of sociology, and most especially cognitive psychology in the first case, and also more specifically anthropological research. And I happened to be talking with someone before the talk, and I asked about the sign for anthropology, and they signed it this way, and I said, what? This is also the sign for Australia in American Sign Language, right? The old sign. And also the British sign was like this, for example, in BSL. So when I saw this as the sign in ASL for anthropology, I'm thinking, Australia, anthropology? So does that mean that all Australians and all anthropologists wear these funny hats that look like this on your head? So I thought, oh, maybe the beginning of anthropological research happened in Australia. Maybe that's why. But nonetheless, I found it very interesting that the signs were similar. And of course, now me being an Australian, what an interesting tie-in as well. One of my real interests in research of interpretation is the sociological and the linguistic impact. My first degree, my Bachelor of Arts degrees in sociology. And I went on then to study on the graduate level interpretation and also linguistics. And then finally my PhD was in linguistics as well. So that means that most of my interest has been focused on the sociolinguistic aspect of interpretation, and that was my personal interest. However, now it is beginning to shift a bit, which it's going to be actually more of a linguistic area of research. So I'm going to invite other researchers to take on the psycholinguistic areas of research while I focus more on the linguistic side.
I don't know if you're able to see the labels on this slide up here. I'll tell you what they say. The one in the center is interpreting research. And this slide represents the overlap among these various areas. Linguistics and interpreting, the overlap there. And I would say there are probably 4 different areas in which it overlaps the field of linguistics. The first is applied linguistics. That's the circle at the top. On the right is sociolinguistics. On the bottom is psycholinguistics. And on the left is functional linguistics. And so there are other areas such as cognitive linguistics and others, but I'm going to focus on these first 4. Next, I'm going to give you some examples of areas where these 4 areas of linguistics have influenced the field of interpreting research. Applied linguistics normally concerns itself with language pedagogy. It looks in the classroom, and it works in the classroom to see exactly what's going on, and there are many ties with applied linguistics to interpreting. When you're doing applied linguistics research, the data that's collected or the information that's collected can be applied to interpreting. And if you think about interpreters and the numbers of interpreters that are, again, working with 2 languages, the number of them who grow up as bilinguals, that number isn't very high. Most of them are second language learners, and they learn that language later in life. And they learn the language generally in a classroom setting, and then they apply it to their work later as they become bilingual. And so interpretation research can be called applied linguistic research. Because understanding and new developments in the field of interpretation can influence the classroom, the applied linguistic research. And so I think that the research can go both ways. And I'll give you an example of that. It was about 4 years ago. I was involved in a research project with a spoken language interpretation colleague. We were interested in talking to interpreters, sign language interpreters, about whether or not they thought that they were bilingual. And we basically just asked them whether or not they were bilingual. And then we asked them which was their dominant language. And again, we were talking about English and Auslan, because we were in Australia doing this research. So we asked which was their dominant language. And then we asked which direction they preferred working, from English to Auslan or Auslan to English. And so we distributed a survey. And when we were able to analyze the results, we had some interesting findings. Most of the people that we surveyed didn't consider themselves fully bilingual, which was shocking because they were all working interpreters. And most of them said that their dominant language was English, which was understandable. That result was something we expected. And most of them said they preferred working from English into Auslan, which was also a bit surprising. Conference interpreting research that had been done at the time suggested that you were more effective working from your B language into your A language. Which means if you're a first language English user, that you should be working into English. But that seemed to contradict the results from the survey that we conducted, who said that they preferred working into their B language. And so I think the results of a survey like that is an interesting piece of information that we can look at when thinking about applied linguistics. These interpreters need to be bilingual. And so if interpreters don't consider themselves bilingual, then what does that mean? What are the implications of that idea? At the recent CIT convention, there was a researcher named Brenda Nicodemus. And it was wonderful to see her research. And she presented similar findings to my survey, except she looked at ASL interpreters and she basically asked them the same question. She asked them what was their preferred language. And most said they preferred working from English into ASL. And then her research went further. She then videotaped their work. So she videotaped their work into spoken English and into ASL. And she took a look at which was more effective. And then she correlated that with what they thought about which language is more effective. And the interesting thing was that the younger interpreters, the new to the field interpreters, said that they preferred going from English into ASL. And the interpreters that were more experienced said that they preferred going from ASL into English.
So just to reiterate, the new interpreters, or the recently trained interpreters, preferred to go into ASL, but their actual work was more successful going into English. So that did not match what they had indicated their preference was. Then when you looked at the highly experienced interpreters, they indicated that they really preferred to go into ASL, but most of them really didn't mind doing either task. So in looking further at that research, they found some similarities between what they said as experienced interpreters and in terms of what their preference was, and also what their accuracy in their work was. So Brenda Nicodemus's theory as to this is that the novice interpreters were not able to do critical self-analysis at the same level. Maybe they could do some, but not extensive self-analysis. Of course, for hearing interpreters, we have auditory feedback that is an immediate reinforcement of the work. But going into ASL, they don't have that immediate feedback. Would they set up a mirror or something in front of them to have this feedback, or not? So again, interpreters who are more seasoned and who have a better sense of analysis of their work were able to perhaps improve their work going into either going from ASL to English or English to ASL.
And then that's an example of how interpreting research can influence the field of applied linguistics while we're teaching languages. And not just when we're teaching interpreting, when we're teaching language itself, we're teaching that second language. It's really important to have an understanding of how it occurs. Now I'll move on to sociolinguistics. Research shows that when there's language being used or a discourse, that the context influences the process of interpretation. So language and context can't be separated. They're inexplicably tied. And it's almost like a marriage. And so if you just focus on spoken language research, there's one woman named Angela Lee who's looked at medical interpreting. And in the process of her research, she followed interpreters who went to medical appointments and observed them working. And she made note of how they managed the interaction. How she stopped the speaker, how the person processed the information or reduced the information, whether the level of detail was sufficient. And it was a 3-year project of actually observing working interpreters in real-life settings. And there was no judgment about the quality of the interpretation. It was just an observation of what was happening. And she was able to look at the environmental influence on the process of the interpreting. Now we'll look at psycholinguistics. As I've previously mentioned, a lot of researchers have looked at the cognitive process of interpreting. They've looked at lag time, and whether with greater lag time, whether information is then missing from the interpretation, for example. They've looked at the chunking of information and how that works. But again, it's always on the cognitive process of interpreting. The fourth area is functional linguistics. Most of these researchers have looked at genre and text types and how this affects the interpretation or translation at a variety of levels. Some of these researchers say that language function is tied to context, and that it's not something separate from context. All of these types of linguistic research can be affected by interpretation research, because they look at language use and culture and how culture is tied to language, the social context, the interaction, communication, and how that occurs, the cognitive processing of language, and others. And so interpretation research, we can see, is tied to all of these areas, and I think the influences go both ways. At the beginning of interpreting research, the original researchers felt that the need was to understand the cognitive process of interpretation and how that occurred. And so psycholinguistic research concerned itself with this area of research, and that gave us a better understanding of language. And so really the purpose of interpreting research was basically just confined to language. Through the years, interpreting research wants to know more about interpretation. And our research can influence the understanding of language, and that's an important tie and an important influence. But we want to know more about interpreting, because that's a very important area that we still need to concern ourselves with. Have you seen this movie? At CIT, my PhD student, Karen Bontempo, was at CIT, and we were in a room with, she gave the plenary speech, and it was a wonderful presentation, and she used this image. And so I asked if I could borrow it for my presentation, because I thought it was so great. You've all seen this movie, right? Nicole Kidman was playing an interpreter. And so people who saw that movie thought that interpreting must be terribly glamorous and a very exciting field, and there must be murder, and we're always working at the UN, and there must be terrible intrigue, and we're all incredibly sexy. And yeah, I mean, that sounds great. I'd love that. But we all know it's not true. Interpretation is not terribly glamorous. I mean, sometimes it is, but most of the time it isn't. But I think all interpreters are terribly sexy. I think that part's true. But this shows one model or one image of interpreting. That when you say interpreting, that's what people imagine. But real life isn't like this. So if it's not like this, then what is it? How can we train interpreters? And how can we have them improve their skills? Are interpreters born, or are they made? And the interpreters cautioned me not to sign condom instead of the sign for immediate or automatic. This is the Australian side. And so I asked the interpreters for the sign for automatic, and I hope I've done it correctly. So in translation and interpreting studies, in that literature, there's an ongoing debate about whether interpreters are born or whether they're made. So some people say that people are automatically just born with the gift of being able to be interpreters. Other people say, no, that's something we can teach people how to do. And I believe that we can teach interpreters, we can train them, but we need research to understand this in greater depth. Because once we have this research, then we will know better how to train interpreters. This is just a nice picture. It doesn't really have any connection to this slide. When we're looking to linguistic research to understand more about interpreting, we need to translate that knowledge when we're giving it to interpreting students. So if we're going from a spoken language to a sign language or a sign language to a spoken language, it's important that we're able to do both of them effectively. And it's not just that we're hearing words, but we're providing an equivalent interpretation. And so it's not just, why signs are created that way or why spoken words are spoken that way. You may be familiar with a woman named Deborah Tannen, and she works here in Washington, D.C. And I think she's actually been here before and presented here at Gallaudet. She has some amazing research that's very important for interpreters to be aware of. Her research has focused on discourse between genders and discourse between siblings, mother-daughter discourse, people in the workplace, how they communicate with one another, and in a wide variety of other settings. And that's important research for us to be aware of as interpreters. When I go into a workplace and I'm interpreting between a male and a female, there are things I need to be aware of. How are they going to interact with one another? What's the dynamic between the two of them? What's the power relationship? Is it a boss-subordinate? Is the male or the female the boss or the subordinate? Are they co-workers? What are the environmental factors at play? What's the language of their workplace? So all of these are things that we need to be aware of. There's a New Zealand researcher named Janet Holmes. And she's done a lot of research in the medical realm and in hospitals, with nurses and doctors, and how they communicate with patients in English. She's looked at communication in the business world, at staff meetings, and so forth. And as I read their research, I realized that as interpreters, we're discourse analysts. And that's our role. And basically that happens automatically. We enter a setting. There are two people there, a deaf person and a hearing person, or maybe there's a small group or a large audience. And automatically we analyze the language and culture and figure out the power relationships. That all happens right away in a very short amount of time. And we make decisions as a result of that information. And so if we understand more about the use of English, say, for example, with hearing people talking to one another, then we're able to make decisions about how hearing and deaf people would communicate and our role in their communication. We also need to know more about how deaf people communicate with one another and again at the recent CIT conference. Brenda Nicodemus, and Laurie Swamy, and there was a doctor named Chris Moreland. The three of them are starting a new project, videotaping a deaf doctor and a deaf patient interacting with one another and looking at how they interact. And that's going to be some very important research. Because this is direct communication. There's no interpreter in this setting. It's only the interaction between the deaf doctor and the deaf patient. So we have this research in English, and that's important that we have that research. But we also need to have this research in ASL so that we can make comparisons. Is the communication different? How is it different? Is the communication the same? What's the effect of the interpreter in the setting? What does the interpreter need to know about the English interactions and discourse and the ASL interactions and discourse?
So we've talked about the large body of research in spoken language interpretation, and also psycholinguistic research in that area, and also community interpreting research, what examples we've seen there. And also, we brought in some sign language research, but now we need to look to the future and what is going to be the need in sign language research going forward. We just talked about the example of medical research and ASL doctor-patient interaction, and that's going to be going forward very soon. So what that means for us as interpreters is when we look at other sign language research and how that influences our understanding of interpretation. So this graphic here on the slide looks at sign language research that will have influence on how we teach interpreters, how interpreting practice is impacted as well, and the type of research we conduct going forward. If you look here at the top, one of my current students that I'm working with in Australia, her name is Della Goswell. She's going to be publishing very soon the research that she has done. And it's going to look at role shift in interpretations. CA and CD. CA, constructed action. CD, constructed dialogue. Her research posed an interesting question. What is the trigger for an interpreter to make a role shift? You know, is it the fact that a question's being posed and then an answer given, or what specifically triggers it? And what about CA and CD do we need to understand as interpreters as to how deaf people use their language and then how that can then be taught to new interpreters? The second bubble, cognitive linguistics, that is being looked at here by Paul Dudas. His research is talking about blends, which again has further implications for interpreters to be mindful of these ideas, especially if a deaf person is making a presentation and making use of space, and how that then implicates the interpreter's interpretation. Two of my colleagues, one named Trevor Johnson, he, I believe, was here last year for about a 6-month period of time. And also another gentleman, Adam Shembry. The two of them conducted research on depicting signs. Used to be called classifiers. We now call them depicting signs. You know, signs of movement and directionality and things like that. So this research is quite important, and it certainly has implications for interpreters as well. Thinking about how deaf signers actually use these elements of language, and then how those elements can be translated. And thinking about, in the opposite direction, when a hearing person is talking about something in English, and then it needs to be translated using these depicting signs, and how that can be done. Again, looking at sociolinguistics, Professor here, C.L. Lucas, has been doing research and publications in this area for quite some time in ASL, and we also have that being done by others in Ausland and also in Irish Sign Language. So we see variations throughout this research. Looking at variations in these types of signs. Also differentiations between genders, different ages of folks and how they use the language. Those people who grew up in schools for the deaf as opposed to those growing up in public schools. Looking at all of these different types of variations of folks that interpreters will be working with, and how we make adjustments to do work with them. So this is research that's certainly going to inform our work going into the future. Of course, we continue to have research on the brain and language comprehension, language processing. Karen Emery is a researcher who's been conducting some of this type of research. Also, Ursula Belugi, who has been doing a lot of brain-based research and sign languages. Also wanting to know what, within this research, what that tells us about language use in general. So there are research centers across the globe focusing on different types of sign language research. Gallaudet has VL2, which has come to fore through some funding from the National Science Foundation. And the National Science Foundation has recognized the importance of this type of research. And of course, I hope that they don't forget to tie this research into the interpreting process as well, because the findings that they are going to have, we don't want that to leave us behind as interpreters, practitioners. So as the research corpus grows, when we have findings from that research, we need to know the implications that it will have on interpreting and our field. So we certainly need to make those correlations as they come to light. My goodness, time is certainly running out. Maybe I've been a little too laid back in my presentation here in terms of time. I'm going to give you just a few more examples of spoken language research and sign language research, and how both of them have implications for interpreting, and how there are many parallels in the research that's been ongoing. We know that there have been findings in spoken language research for quite some time, and as even your president mentioned, there have been sign language research going on for many years as well, but there are correlates that we are noticing that are quite important. So we see research in interpretation and research in language that has overlaps very important for interpreters to be aware of the interpreting process and dialogue and communication. And we're understanding that the exact language isn't the most important thing. There are certainly differences that we've recognized between signed language interpreters and spoken language interpreters as it relates to cultural issues around hearing people versus deaf people and those dynamics. So research into interpretation is quite important, and it allows us to make those ties between the language research and our work. Who in the audience, who in general does research on sign language interpretation? Mostly university scholars are doing this type of work. So physicians have noticed that they've had to use interpreters with their patients quite over some time. So what does that mean for research, and what research opportunities might we see there? We also have interpreter practitioners that would sometimes feel compelled to take on research work. So we might call them practice searchers. This is kind of a term that Daniel Gilles has coined, where a practitioner becomes a researcher, but yet the research is still tied into their practice. So they're practice searchers. And also, it affords the opportunity to work with researchers in other specialties. I personally have done research with attorneys and having deaf folks sit in as jurors. In Australia, currently, this is not offered to deaf Australians, where it is in the United States. Isn't that correct? Throughout all the 50 states? Australia has not gotten to that point yet. So I've been trying to work collaboratively with an attorney to see if this can happen. The mindset in Australia seems to be that, will the deaf person be able to gain sufficient understanding so as to be able to determine guilt or innocence of a person? So we would like to be able to show that, that in fact, yes, they can. That a deaf person receiving an interpreted passage is able to understand as much as a hearing person who is listening in. Of course, there is, the reverse can be true as well, that if a hearing person cannot take in information as well as a deaf person might miss some information. So not all hearing people have complete fluency in legal vocabulary. So we have this research going on that I am working with an attorney to develop right now. Working with another therapist as well, focusing on mental health interpretation and what is happening during an interpreted mental health event. So we're hoping to combine our mutual expertise to determine what is actually going on in a therapeutic interpreted event. We do need more collaborative research between spoken language interpreters and signed language interpreters and researchers working together. There is one woman named Sherry Shaw, who is from, is it the University of North Florida, UNF. And she has actually published research in conjunction with spoken language researchers from Europe. Their work is very interesting, where they compared successful student interpreters and the screening process that the student interpreters had to go through to get into their programs. What areas of research should we look at? Schlesinger had reviewed 10 years' worth of articles. Most of them were in the realm of spoken language interpretation. But upon reviewing them, she found there were many articles that had been published based solely on an interpreter's intuition and their interests. Perhaps while they were practicing interpretation, an incident or something happened while they were interpreting. And they realized that they wanted to conduct research on this particular item and then went ahead and did it. So again, the idea of researching what you know. As a working practitioner, let's say in a legal setting, or a practitioner in the medical setting as an interpreter, why would I go ahead and research education, being that my daily experience and my intuition lies in the work that I do most often? So it would make sense for us to start research in these areas. Also, if we realize something that we need to know in terms of a research question, that might lead us down the path of research. In the state of New South Wales in Australia, which is where Sydney is, it's right in this, Sydney is located in the center of that state. The New South Wales legal system is wondering about bringing in sign language interpreters via a conferencing technology or video conferencing technology in the courtroom. If they're unable to secure an interpreter in person, they were thinking that both the cost will be reduced as well as it'll save time to bring in an interpreter via video conferencing. So they're looking into the possibilities of that and designing a research study with several different situations that they're taking a look at. First being having an interpreter in the room, in the courtroom, with the parties involved, and the deaf person being off-site. Then the second location being the deaf person on-site and the interpreter off-site. The third, both the deaf person and the interpreter off-site of the courtroom. Next, both the deaf person and the interpreter present in the courtroom. And then the last being the deaf person off-site and the interpreter at a separate site and the courtroom being the third site. So these are 5 areas where research is being conducted to see the effectiveness of those situations and the use of an interpreter. They're doing that by interviewing people. The deaf people having a difficult time seeing, or is the interpreter having a difficult time seeing? And they're surveying them about their preferences and their frustrations in these types of scenarios. The findings from this research showed that it doesn't look promising. The equipment is not compatible with this type of a setting. The camera is not able to zoom in or pan the courtroom, meaning that the deaf person is not able to see the whole realm of the courtroom or the witness box, for example. So how do you sign witness here? Okay, thank you. So if a witness is there and the deaf person is not present in the courtroom, how does that impact the situation? So this research is going to then impact the policy decisions that the court makes in light of these findings.
So when practitioners experience a problem while interpreting, that might be the source of a research question. There might be a problem that they observe in other interpreters. The research question may come from questions posed by stakeholders. And so there are a wide variety of ways or possibilities for locating the research problem. Again, this picture was stolen from my PhD student, Karen. And again, this picture, I think, exemplifies the misunderstandings about interpreters, that people don't really know what we do, and generally assume that what we do is a very simplistic process. To do any research, we need data. We need to collect a quantity of data and then conduct an analysis in order to come up with a finding. And that finding is then connected to our research question. Many people may wonder how interpreting research is conducted because they are thinking about the scientific model or the laboratory scientific model, which involves beakers and chemicals and smoke and things like that. And interpreting research is not that kind of research. Research can be conducted in the lab. An experiment can be conducted in that setting. In one experiment from spoken language research, they asked a number of interpreters to interpret the same passage all at the same time. And they attached electrodes both on the skull and in the mouth to measure saliva production, because the saliva production indicated the presence of stress. So the increased saliva production, or actually the saliva had a hormone that indicated the presence of stress, and it was a particular hormone that they looked at to indicate increased stress levels. So again, they were trying to sort of correlate the cognitive load with the indication of stress, which was indicated by the amount of the stress hormone in the saliva. Interpreting research has a variety of quantitative surveys, quantitative research. They can be experimental. And they may compare 10 interpreters or 20 interpreters and have them do the same task and then compare the product. And then employ statistics on the work that's produced and were the omissions critical omissions or inconsequential. And that's been, like the research I've done and many others have done. There's also surveys. So you survey interpreters and employ statistics to make comparisons. I'm involved in a research project currently with East Kentucky University. And we've designed a research study, a research survey, that's looking at personality traits. And actually, you may have received one of the questionnaires online. We surveyed interpreters all over the world. We received 1,600 responses. From 38 different countries. And so I'm now in the process of analyzing that research. And so it'll be interesting to see, not only in the United States, but also in Australia and New Zealand and in the UK, the results and make some comparisons across personality traits. And so using that, the results from that test, maybe we'll be able to make some predictions on the personality traits of people who want to go into that field and whether or not they are likely to be successful in the field. Next, we'll talk about a couple of qualitative studies that were observation-based, looking at what really happens in interpreting situations. Experimental studies could be thought of as happening in the lab and disconnected from the real world. So qualitative studies follow interpreters in their day-to-day routine, videotaping interactions. Cynthia Roy and Melanie Metzger have done videotaping of interpreters in real-world situations. Actually, trying to come up with a sign for a dentist, I used the Ausline sign, and then the BSL sign, and then finally I got to the ASL sign for dentist. Anyway, so videotaping interpreters in dental offices. And that's an example of this type of research. This is a group discussion. I've actually videotaped interviews, small group discussions with groups of deaf people, groups that include an interpreter, and groups with hearing people, and made comparisons across the different types of groups. And that's given us valuable information that we need to incorporate in our teaching. Triangulation is very important. You can make comparisons between different types of experiments. You can take a survey, do a comparative study, take interviews, and then videotape actual interpreting so that you're able to look at the problem, the same question, from a variety of perspectives. And so this can be a very effective approach in coming to an understanding of the research question. Research can occur in a wide variety of settings, in medical, legal, education, and the workplace. Basically, wherever interpreters go, you can conduct research there. Action research is focused on the practitioner. If the practitioner notices something that is a problem for them and that they're interested in doing research on, they may have been able to identify the problem, but then after they do research, it might lead to another question that needs to be researched, and so on. This is another image I borrowed from my PhD student, Karen. I thought this was a nice image that shows how we analyze our intuition, how we can think about what's going on in our heads while we're interpreting. And so I think this exemplifies the thought and the pondering that happens among practitioners. I just want to quickly go through this and sum up. I know our time is running out. So this means that really all interpreters can be researchers. It takes research out of the ivory tower, where academics are doing all of the research disconnected from the realities of the day-to-day work that interpreters are doing. The academics need to work with practitioners. I'm still a working interpreter. I don't do it every day, but I keep involved in the field because it's an important element of both my research and my teaching. So basically, to sum up, if you'd like to be a researcher, you have to ask yourself why. What's the goal? and how it can impact the community at large. You also need to think, I mean, once you've identified the goal of your research, who does that research benefit? The research can be published and it can benefit other interpreters and scholars. But what does it do for the community? And so keep that in mind while doing your research. Don't forget the community. Also, don't forget other professionals. We talk about medical interpreting a great deal, and we can publish a lot of that research, but we mustn't forget the medical professionals who the research can also benefit. So the last idea I'd like to leave with you is that Gallaudet is a model in this field. We have a bachelor's program here at Gallaudet. There are graduate programs. And then just recently, Gallaudet has established its PhD and a research center. And so that's an incredible model to show how important the field of interpreting and interpreting research is, and how important teaching interpreters is, and how important it is to teach interpreters research methods. And this brings us back to the title, Nexus for Change. What does it mean to be a nexus of change? Through my remarks today talking about linguistic research and translation and interpreting research, hopefully all of these areas influence one another, and they influence policy and practice and service, and it's one chain, one nexus for change. Here's a slide with candy or a snack. So because you've spent the last, 90 minutes watching my ASL, I thought I'd bring you a little treat, and this is your treat. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Dr. Napier. I'd like to thank the audience very much for coming. We have a reception outside, and then we're going to be having a student discussion with Dr. Napier at that conclusion of the reception. So thank you, everyone, and have a wonderful afternoon.